Welcome to the fourth episode of Gender Trouble, the podcast where we dive deep into Judith Butler's seminal work, Gender Trouble, a radical rethinking of feminism, identity, and the very meaning of gender. Today, we're plunging into section 3 of the book, the part called Subversive Bodily Acts, specifically pages 101 to 180 of the text you shared.
Right, and this is where Butler, well, she really gets into the nitty-gritty of the body itself. It moves past just unpacking sex and gender conceptually, and looks at how our very sense of having a body, where it starts and stops, it's sex even, how that's all tangled up with social power, with language.
Okay.
It draws on some pretty dense stuff, psychoanalysis, biology, anthropology.
Right, so it sounds like we're moving from the theory of identity to the actual physical experience of it, but finding out maybe it's not so simply physical after all.
Exactly. The ground floor of the body turns out to be, well, a landscape shaped by rules we don't always see.
So our mission here is to really unpack Butler's arguments about that connection, body, power, discourse, and figure out where she sees possibilities for, pushing back, subversion.
Yeah, precisely. We'll look at how she questions ideas about some kind of natural sexuality existing before the law or outside culture. And interestingly, how even science, like biology, might get framed by gendered ideas without even realizing it.
And then how everyday stuff, like how people act or perform their gender, can actually mess with those categories.
That's the plan. Exploring this landscape, finding the hidden rules, and seeing what happens when they get challenged.
Okay, so where does Butler start this exploration in section 3?
She begins by engaging with Julia Kristeva, specifically Kristeva's idea of the semiotic.
The semiotic, okay. That sounds a bit academic. What's the core idea there? What's Kristeva getting at?
Well, Kristeva thinks the semiotic as this pre-linguistic realm.
Okay.
Think drives, instincts, the rhythms you might associate with, like an infant's connection to the maternal body. It's this kind of fluid, potentially disruptive energy that exists sort of alongside or maybe before the symbolic.
And the symbolic is...
That's the world of language, rules, social structure, the law, often linked to the paternal figure in the established order.
So semiotic is like raw energy. Symbolic is the structure trying to contain it. Is that too simple?
It's a decent starting point.
Right.
Kristeva sees things like, say, poetic language or that intense maternal bond as moments where the semiotic kind of erupts through the symbolic. Little disruptions.
Okay, moments of resistance. But Butler takes issue with this, right? She critiques Kristeva.
She does. And it's a really important point for Butler's own argument. Her critique is that Kristeva seems to locate this subversive energy, the semiotic, the maternal, as being outside of culture or somehow beneath the symbolic law.
And why is that a problem, putting it outside?
Because if the source of resistance is fundamentally separate from the system of power and language, well, how can it ever lead to lasting, meaningful change within that system? It makes subversion seem like, temporary bursts rather than real transformation.
Okay. The rebellion always stays external and never gets integrated or changes the rules themselves.
Exactly. Which leads Butler to ask this really critical question. Okay, but what if the very idea of a before the law, this pre-discursive space, what if that idea itself is actually produced by the law? By the cultural system.
Whoa.
Yeah, why does the system need to imagine an outsider? Maybe that concept serves a function within the system it claims to precede.
That really flips the perspective, suggests our ideas of natural or pre-cultural might just be cultural constructs themselves.
Precisely. And that line of thinking leads us directly into her engagement with another huge figure for this section, Michel Foucault.
Foucault, right. Power, discourse. How does he fit into this discussion about bodies and sex?
Foucault is absolutely central here because he argues directly against that idea of a natural pre-existing sexuality that's just waiting to be liberated from repression. He tosses out the whole notion of some kind of liberatory eros that exists before power gets its hands on it.
So it's not power squashing sexuality, it's power actually creating it, is that right?
That's the core Foucaultian insight Butler's working with here, yeah. Sexuality isn't this raw thing power acts on. Instead, power relations, discourses, the way we talk about sex, categorize it, confess it all that produces sexuality as something we can know, manage, and control.
So talking about it brings it into being, in a way.
In a very real, socially effective way, yes. And he uses this to critique some models of liberation, including, Butler notes, some feminist approaches.
Oh, so?
Well, the critique is that if you take sex as this natural given, this subject you just need to free, you might be missing the point. If sex itself is a category produced and regulated by power structures, then just trying to liberate sex without asking how that category got made in the first place, you might just end up reinforcing the very power you're trying to fight.
Wow, okay. That's a challenging thought. The sex body isn't the starting point. It's an effect of being caught up in these social rules and ways of talking.
Exactly. It's produced. So the task isn't just liberation of sex, but understanding the history of how sex became this thing we think we know, this thing that can be governed.
And this idea of sex as an effect, not a foundation, you mentioned. Butler uses the story of Herculine Barbin to illustrate this. Foucault wrote about her too.
Yes, Herculine's story is really poignant here. Her journals, which Foucault brought to light, tell this story of someone identified as intersex anatomical ambiguities, not fitting neatly into the male-female boxes. And the medical and legal systems of the time just couldn't handle it. They demanded a single, clear sex category be assigned.
And Butler points out that Herculine becomes this example of, what do you say, the sexual impossibility of an identity within that binary system.
Right, her existence itself kind of breaks the binary logic. Her own writings express this intense suffering, feeling like a natural mistake, this sense of metaphysical homelessness, just struggling with who she was supposed to be, what she felt.
Foucault saw this as a disruption then, challenging that neat alignment we assume between biological sex, gender identity, and desire.
Yeah, he saw Herculine's life as revealing how constructed those links really are.
Yeah.
Butler digs into Herculine's descriptions, like feeling different from the women in the convent she desired, feeling like a usurper of male privilege even while desiring women. It wasn't simple.
Not just fitting into a pre-made box.
Not at all. It shows a really complex navigation of desire and identity within a system that tries to deny that complexity.
And there's that bit about Foucault's shattering laughter when asked about, like, lesbian versus gay male differences.
Butler brings that up, yeah.
Yeah.
Suggesting it wasn't dismissive laughter, but more like an explosion of the categories themselves. A refusal to be pinned down by the binary of some versus other, maybe echoing thinkers like Borges or Bataille, who played with those boundaries.
Okay, so we see the binary challenged in individual lives in philosophy, but then Butler takes it somewhere maybe even more surprising, right into biology.
Yes. This is such a fascinating move. She looks at actual scientific research, specifically the hunt for a single master gene for sex, like Dr. David Page's work looking for the TDF gene on the Y chromosome, the thing thought to be the switch for male development.
And that research was driven by cases where chromosomes, like XX or XY, didn't line up with the person's assigned sex, right? Trying to find the biological root.
Exactly. But Butler highlights critiques from other scientists, like Aisher and Washburn, who pointed something out about how the research was framed.
What was the framing issue?
They pointed out the research was essentially asking about male determination, or testes determination.
Meaning it was searching for the active male factor, and female development was just sort of the default, the absence of the male switch.
Pretty much. The question wasn't equally what determines ovaries. It was implicitly framed around finding the male trigger.
Sure.
And Butler argues this shows how cultural assumptions about gender, male as active, female as passive, or defined by lack, were actually shaping the scientific questions being asked about biological sex.
So culture shaped the science that was supposed to be finding the pre-cultural fact of sex.
That's the provocative insight. It makes it really hard to draw a clean line between sex and gender when the scientific search for sex is already influenced by gendered ideas. Biology isn't this pure separate foundation. It's participating in cultural history.
Wow, okay. That connects back, doesn't it, to Simone de Beauvoir. One is not born a woman, but becomes one.
Absolutely. Beauvoir made that crucial split. Sex as the biological fact, she thought immutable, and gender as the cultural construction built on top of it.
But Butler sees something more radical lurking in Beauvoir's idea.
Yeah, she pushes it further. If gender is acquired, if it's constructed and not strictly limited by biological sex, then maybe gender isn't tied to a pre-existing sex at all.
And if it's not tied down,
Then it doesn't have to stick to just two options, male and female. Gender could, theoretically, proliferate way beyond the binary.
which leads to that idea of gender not as a thing you are, but something you're constantly doing, a performance.
Right. If you're always becoming a woman or a man, etc., but never arrive at a final fixed state, then gender is this ongoing activity, an incessant performance, a repetition of actions and gestures, not a static identity marker.
And Monique Wittig takes this idea of cultural construction even further, you said, more confrontationally.
Oh, much more. Wittig's position is really strong. She basically argues that the whole category of sex, male-female, is created by the system of compulsory heterosexuality, specifically to oppress women and enforce heteronormativity.
So for her, sex isn't biological, it's purely a political category.
Yes, and her solution is radical. Overthrow the entire discourse on sex. Get rid of the very grammar that makes us think of gender as an attribute of a pre-existing
Well,
sex.
she saw language itself as doing the work of oppression, like naming someone man or woman is an act of power.
Absolutely. For Wittig, language performs reality. Repeating these classifications, naming sexes, isn't just describing things, it's creating the effect of natural divisions. It's an act of domination that makes inequality seem natural.
And her materialism is tied to how institutions like compulsory heterosexuality basically invent nature to justify themselves.
Exactly. Nature becomes an ideological tool. In her own writing, her literature tries to fight back by twisting and repurposing the oppressive language itself, a different strategy than just trying to step outside it.
This keeps coming back to bodies, boundaries, what's in and out, natural and unnatural, which brings us to Mary Douglas and ideas about pollution.
Right. Douglas studied social taboos, particularly around the body. She suggested that societies draw lines literally and figuratively around bodies, marking boundaries through rules about purity and danger, to impose some kind of order on messy reality.
So our sense of our own body's edges, what's clean or dirty, inside or outside, that's not just biology, it's socially defined.
That's the idea. And reading this through a post-structuralist lens, as Butler does, those boundaries and taboos signify the limits of what's socially acceptable, what the dominant culture allows. Douglas asked, why are the body's margins, skin, openings, fluids, waste, why are they always charged with power and danger?
Because that's where the system is vulnerable, like the edges of a territory.
Kind of, yeah. Systems feel vulnerable at their boundaries. And Butler connects this directly to how homosexuality, particularly gay men, were framed during the AIDS crisis, drawing on Simon Watney's work.
The horrific gay disease label.
Exactly. Watney showed how homosexuality was already linked in homophobic discourse, with crossing boundaries, certain sexual acts seen as blurring inside-outside, and with ideas of pollution even before AIDS. The epidemic just massively amplified that existing prejudice, casting gay men as these polluting figures threatening the social body itself.
Portrayed as both uncivilized, breaking social rules, and unnatural, breaking biological ones.
Right. Transgressing both kinds of boundaries. And Kursave's concept of the abject helps explain this mechanism psychologically.
The abject, that was the stuff we push out to define ourselves, right? Like waste.
Exactly. It's the stuff that was maybe part of us or threatens our sense of being separate and clean that we have to violently expel or define as other to establish our own identity and boundaries. It's repulsion that creates the self.
So we create the inside self by making something else the outside, repulsive other.
That's the dynamic. And thinkers like Iris Young applied this to understand sexism, racism, homophobia, how dominant groups consolidate their identity by projecting unwanted traits or anxieties onto marginalized groups, making them the abject other.
And that fear of boundaries breaking down, like through certain desires or fluids crossing lines,
is ultimately a fear of the self collapsing, of that distinction between the proper subject and the abject other dissolving. Inner and outer become these fragile, culturally maintained fantasies, not just physical facts.
Okay, so after mapping out how bodies, sex, and boundaries are all caught up in discourse and power, this leads us to Butler's most famous idea from this section, right? Subversive bodily acts like drag.
Yes, exactly. Things like drag, cross-dressing, butch femme dynamics, they often get dismissed as just, copying stereotypes or being derivative.
But Butler says they can be parodic. What's the difference? How is drag parody?
Well, parody isn't just imitation. It's imitation with a twist. It highlights the artificiality, the constructedness of the thing it's imitating. In drag, you often see this obvious dissonance, right? Between maybe the assigned anatomical sex, the gender being performed, maybe even the performer's own gender identity. It creates a gap.
Okay.
And that performance doesn't just imitate woman or man. Butler argues it performs the structure of gender itself, the way gender is supposed to be a coherent imitation of an ideal. And by performing that structure imperfectly, or with exaggeration, it exposes that the original gender was already an imitation, already a performance.
So drag reveals that all gender is a kind of performance, not just the drag version. It shows the strings, so to speak.
That's the idea. And she suggests the pleasure, the sort of giddiness of drag, comes from seeing that gap, recognizing the contingency, the lack of a necessary connection between biological sex and performed gender, the very connection culture tells us is natural and solid. Drag makes the artificiality visible, maybe even funny.
It denaturalizes sex and gender by showing them in this different, maybe discordant context.
Exactly. It strips them of that feeling of being inevitable or inherently true. The point isn't that some genders are real and others fake. It's that the claim to reality or naturalness itself can be exposed as fragile, as performative, through these kinds of acts.
Which brings us to the wrap-up of this section, where she pulls these threads together: construction, agency, performance, repetition.
Right. She lands on this idea that identity isn't some deep internal essence we have. It's an effect. It's produced through all these repeated actions, norms, ways of speaking. Famously, she says there's no doer behind the deed. The sense of being a subject, a doer, is actually constructed in and through the doing, through the performance of gender norms.
That's still kind of mind-bending. So agency, our ability to act or choose, it doesn't come from stepping outside all that construction.
No, according to this view, agency is found within that very process of construction, within signification, within performance.
How does that work if we're constructed by repetition?
Think about it. Intelligible identities, the ones society recognizes, are built through repeating norms over and over. But agency, Butler suggests, lies in the possibility of variation within that repetition.
Like a slight change, a different inflection in the repeated act.
Exactly. A subversive repetition. And the real body, the natural sex we're supposed to have, that's often like a fantasy, an ideal image that bodies are forced to try and approximate, but maybe never quite reach. Subversive acts, like drag, expose the gap between that phantasmatic ideal and the lived body.
And showing that gap reveals the natural itself is a performance.
Precisely. So being constructed isn't the death of agency. Butler argues construction is the necessary scene of agency. It's the space where change becomes possible.
So the task isn't escaping construction, but finding ways to repeat norms differently, subversively, from within the identities we inhabit.
Yes. Participating in the practices that make us who we are, but doing it with a difference, a critical awareness that contests the normativity that opens up other possibilities.
Wow. Okay, that was a really deep dive. We went from the body feeling solid to seeing how it's shaped by history, language, power, how even sex isn't a simple fact.
Yeah, and it really challenges that common idea that resistance has to come from some pure place outside the system.
Instead, the potential for change is right here, inside the everyday stuff, the repetitions that make up our identities.
It's in those variations, those dissonances in performance, subtle shifts.
So, for you listening, what does this mean? If gender, maybe even our understanding of biological sex, is performative, built through repetition, does that shift how you think about your own body, your own gender identity, or the expectations you see around you?
Yeah, and if identity is an effect, and agency is about varying the repetition, what tiny, maybe unnoticed subversive variations are already happening all around us in just everyday life? What happens when we start to pay attention to them, maybe even consciously play with them?